Oregon has over 200 ghost towns, and most people have no idea how many are hiding across the state. Some were built on gold, some were abandoned almost overnight, and some still have buildings standing exactly where they were left. These are 12 of the most fascinating ghost towns in Oregon, and number 1 is the one that should be taught in schools. Number 12, Bayocean, Oregon. There is a stretch of coastline near Tillamook where people paid good money for vacation homes. Investors bought land expecting it to grow in value, and developers promised it would become the most successful beach resort on the West Coast. Every single one of those buildings is now at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. In the early 1900s, a father and son development company from Portland found a narrow sand spit between Tillamook Bay and the ocean and became convinced it was the perfect location for a luxury resort community. They called it the Atlantic City of the West. They sold more than 600 lots and built a hotel, a bowling alley, a theater, a heated saltwater pool with a wave machine, and an entire neighborhood of homes on land that sat only a few feet above sea level. What nobody fully understood was that the town existed because of a delicate balance of ocean currents moving through the entrance to Tillamook Bay. When a jetty was built to improve navigation for ships entering the bay, those currents shifted. Erosion started on the ocean side of the spit and never stopped. First, the storms took the natatorium. Then 59 homes fell into the sea. Then a gale breached the spit entirely, turning Bayocean into an island and accelerating the destruction further. The post office closed, the last house went. The final structure, a garage, fell into the ocean in 1971, and that was the end of it. What makes it worse is that many of the property owners had supported the jetty project themselves, believing it would help the town grow. They changed the one thing keeping their community above water, and the Pacific took everything they had built. Today, Bayocean is a hiking trail. The streets, homes, hotel, theater, and swimming pool now lie beneath the ocean, and some of the lots people paid for over a century ago are literally underwater. Number 11, Millican, Oregon. Most ghost towns disappear because people gradually leave until nobody remains. Millican is unusual because by the end, the entire town depended on a single man, and when he died, the town effectively died with him. The settlement was founded in the 1880s as a small ranching community in Oregon's high desert, but after the highway was rerouted in 1930, traffic began bypassing the town and the population steadily declined as businesses closed and residents moved away. By the time Bill Mellon took over the gas station and general store in 1945, much of the town was already gone. He stayed anyway and kept the last business running for more than 40 years. He knew the travelers who stopped in by name. He played cribbage with whoever came through. Every night before he went to sleep, he left 8 to 10 gallons of gas in the pump, so anyone pulling off the highway after hours could help themselves. By the 1980s, he was the only permanent resident in a town that existed in name only. Just one man, one store, and a stretch of high desert highway. In 1988, one of his employees killed him. After that, Millican had no one left. Several attempts were made to reopen the store in the years that followed, but none lasted. In 2017, the property went up for sale for $1.5 million, the only commercially zoned property between Bend and Brothers. Nobody bought it. The building is still there. The pump is still there. The man who kept the light on for 40 years is not. Number 10, Golden, Oregon. Most ghost towns in Oregon are a few foundations in the woods, a cemetery you have to search for, and a sign that might tell you what stood there. The reason Golden is worth stopping for is that it looks nothing like that. The church still looks like a church, the buildings are still standing, and almost nobody outside the county knows it exists. The mining camp on Coyote Creek was born during the 1840s gold rush and grew into a real community. A church, a school, a general store. At its peak, it held around 150 residents, and when the Campbellite congregation built their church in 1892, it looked like a place that was planning to stay. The gold played out by the early 1900s. Without the mines, there was no reason to be there, and the families left quietly, one by one. What makes Golden unusual is that they left the buildings standing and nobody tore them down after. The church still has its original pews. The last service was held there sometime in the early 1900s, and the building has been standing in that clearing ever since, waiting for a congregation that never came back. 4 structures remain today, preserved in a forest clearing with signs explaining what each building was. It is the kind of place that makes you realize most of Oregon's ghost towns didn't disappear, they just stopped being noticed. Number 9. Sheniko, Oregon. In 1903, a single day of wool sales in one small Oregon town topped $1 million. 10 years later, that same town was nearly empty. The state government officially declared it a ghost town, and the reason it collapsed had nothing to do with a disaster. A competing railroad just opened a faster route nearby and took all the business with it. Sheniko started as a stage stop in the high desert called Cross Hollow. When the Columbia Southern Railroad arrived in 1900 and made it the regional hub for moving wool, grain, and livestock out of Central Oregon, the town transformed almost overnight. At its peak, it was known as the wool capital of the world, and with 600 residents, a hotel, a bank, a school, and the largest wool warehouse in the state, that title didn't feel like an exaggeration. Then, in 1911, the Oregon Trunk Railway opened a faster line through Bend and pulled most of the freight traffic away. Fires hit that same year, and there was no money to rebuild. The town emptied out behind them. In 1959, the Oregon Centennial Commission officially declared Sheniko Oregon's Ghost Town of the Year, the only piece of formal recognition the town has ever received. The 1912 schoolhouse still has its original chalkboards. The jail cells inside City Hall are still intact. The hotel, closed for 16 years, reopened in 2023. Number 8. Buncom, Oregon. Gold rush camps in southern Oregon don't usually survive. Fire takes them, or the forest does, or a century of neglect finishes the job. The reason Buncom still has anything standing at all comes down to one thing: a small group of people who decided the place was worth saving and never stopped showing up. The camp on Sterling Creek in the Applegate Valley was one of the first mining settlements in Oregon, founded in 1851 after Chinese miners discovered gold following strikes near Jacksonville. What it notably did not have for much of its existence was a saloon. The founders had specifically agreed to ban one, which set Bunkham apart from virtually every other mining camp in the state. The gold ran out in the early 20th century, and the community dissolved the way most small Oregon towns did. Not dramatically, just gradually. 3 buildings survived. The Bunkham Historical Society has maintained those 3 structures ever since and holds a festival every May to raise money to keep them standing. Every year, descendants of the families who lived there come back to Sterling Creek and stand next to buildings their great-grandparents worked in a clearing the forest has been trying to reclaim for 100 years. 3 buildings, that's all that's left, and people are still fighting to keep them. Number 7. Bourne, Oregon. Most mining towns in eastern Oregon collapsed because the gold ran out. Bourne had a different problem. The gold ran out, and then a con man moved in and kept the town alive for a decade by selling fake mining investments to people in London and New York who had no idea the mines were already empty. The camp on Cracker Creek in Baker County started as a real gold town. A genuine strike in 1888 brought around 1,500 people to the area by the mid-1890s, working legitimate operations including the North Pole Mine and the Eureka and Excelsior. The town was named for Jonathan Bourne, a lawyer who bought one of the mines in 1899 and later became a United States Senator for Oregon. By the early 1900s, the productive mines were winding down. Into that gap stepped F. Wallace White, who had identified that London financiers were buying Oregon mine stock sight unseen, trusting the paperwork more than the ground. He built a mansion in Bourne specifically to impress visiting investors, ran a printing press a contemporary said barely had time to cool down for 6 years, and sold shares in mining companies whose assets existed mainly on paper. He swindled investors across the United States and Europe for over a decade. In 1915, the scheme unraveled and White fled just ahead of investigators. The real mines were already exhausted. The mansion he had built to impress people with a dying town stood empty, and within a few years, there was nothing left in Bourne worth staying for. Number 6. The logging towns of the Coast Range, Oregon. Most towns fail for complicated reasons. An industry collapses, a railroad bypasses them, the population slowly drifts away. The logging towns of the Oregon Coast Range failed for a simpler reason. They were never designed to survive. They were built to be used and left behind. The pattern repeated across every valley in the Coast Range. A company arrived, built a mill and workers' housing, and set crews cutting through the surrounding forest as fast as the equipment allowed. When the trees ran out, the equipment was loaded onto trucks and moved to the next valley with timber left in it. The workers followed. The buildings were left or burned. Bridal Veil in the Columbia River Gorge lasted nearly a century because it operated as a finishing mill, processing timber that arrived via a 1.5-mile flume down from Larch Mountain, something more durable than a raw logging camp. When the mill finally closed, what remained was a cemetery and a post office that is still open today for one reason. Couples mail wedding invitations through Bridal Veil specifically for the postmark. On the other end of the spectrum was Idiotville, deep in Tillamook County's Wilson River watershed. No roads in, no roads out except the logging trucks, and a name that tells you exactly what kind of place it was. When the timber was gone, there was nothing left to name. Those two towns are the full range of what the Coast Range logging era looked like. The ones that survived found something other than timber to sustain them. The ones that didn't are in the second growth forest now, their foundations under the ferns. If the stories of places nobody talks about are why you watch this channel, drop a comment and tell me what forgotten town in your state deserves to be on this list. Number 5. Copperfield, Oregon. In 1914, the governor of Oregon had a town on the Snake River that had completely broken down. The local government was run by saloon owners. Competing businesses were setting each other on fire, and the sheriff told the governor there was no law he could invoke and no witnesses willing to testify. So the governor sent his 30-year-old private secretary to fix it, with 5 soldiers, and it worked. Copperfield had boomed around 1907 as a construction and mining camp, peaking at close to 1,000 people with more than a dozen saloons and no churches. When the construction projects finished and the workers left, the owners who remained turned on each other. The town council was staffed almost entirely by saloon employees who made sure the sheriff never had a reason to show up. Governor Oswald West sent his secretary Fern Hobbs, along with 5 National Guardsmen, to depose the mayor, arrest the council, and shut every saloon in town. When word got out that a woman was coming to clean up Copperfield, the mayor decorated the streets with ribbons and flowers as a joke. She stepped off the train, walked into the dance hall where the officials were assembled, read the governor's order aloud, and asked the mayor to resign. He refused. She arrested him anyway. The story made national headlines. The saloon owners sued the governor and lost twice. Most of what remained burned down in 1915. The record doesn't say whether it was an accident. A second fire in 1917 finished what remained. A town that had been placed under martial law and had its entire government removed by executive order simply ceased to exist before anyone got around to making it official. If the stories of places nobody talks about are why you watch this channel, drop a comment and tell me what forgotten town in your state deserves to be on this list. Number 4. Sumpter, Oregon. Most towns that burn down and lose their main industry stay dead. Sumpter almost did, and then a machine the size of a city block showed up and spent the next 37 years eating the valley floor. 5 South Carolinians found gold at the site in 1862 and named their settlement after Fort Sumpter. The installation, whose fall had started the war, they had presumably just fought on the losing side. The Sumpter Valley Railway arrived in 1897 and turned a small camp into something much larger. By 1900, $9 million in gold had come out of the surrounding mines. The town had 16 saloons, 2 churches, an opera house, and electric lights, in that order of priority, apparently. People were building houses and businesses with the expectation that Sumpter was going to be there for a long time. Then a fire ripped through in 1917 and burned most of it to the ground in a single night. What rebuilt afterward was smaller, and the mines were running thin. Then in 1935, the Sumpter Valley Dredge began operating around the clock, 7 days a week, the only breaks being Christmas and the 4th of July. It was a floating factory processing the entire floor of the Powder River Valley for gold and spitting the waste out behind it in piles that permanently reshaped the landscape. It ran until 1954 and pulled over $4 million in gold out of ground the earlier miners had already worked. The chain of ponds that lines the valley today, where the river used to run, is what the dredge left behind. The machine itself is still there, sitting in a pond of its own making. It is one of the stranger things you can stand next to in eastern Oregon. Number 3. Jawbone Flats, Oregon. In the 1970s, logging companies filed plans to cut down one of the last intact old-growth forests left in Oregon. The legal fight to stop them lasted 26 years. What nobody expected was that a long-abandoned mining camp sitting in the middle of that forest would become one of the strongest arguments for saving it. Jawbone Flats was a small mining settlement established in the 1930s deep in the North Santiam Canyon, remote enough that the industrial logging that stripped most of the surrounding Cascades had never reached it. When the mine closed in the 1960s, the buildings were left standing, and the old-growth forest around them stayed intact. When the logging companies came for that forest, the people fighting to protect it realized Jawbone Flats mattered, not just as a ghost town, but as proof that something worth protecting had existed there long before anyone arrived with a chainsaw. The fight ran all the way to 1996, when Congress permanently protected the Opal Creek watershed as a designated wilderness area. The buildings were converted into a wilderness education center that still operates today inside that protected forest. If you hike in there now, you are standing in a canyon that logging companies spent nearly 3 decades trying to clear, surrounded by old-growth trees that were scheduled to come down next to cabins still standing because enough people refused to let them go. The mine is gone. Everything else is still there. Number 2. Antelope, Oregon. In the early 1980s, a small ranching town in the Oregon high desert was quietly dying. A few dozen residents, aging buildings, no particular reason for the outside world to pay attention. Then a religious organization moved onto a ranch nearby, and within 4 years the original residents of Antelope were living under what many of them described as a state of fear inside their own town. A spiritual leader named Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh had fled India following conflicts with authorities there and purchased a 100,000-acre ranch a few miles outside Antelope. His followers began building a city from scratch, their own airstrip, their own police force, their own zip code, and eventually up to 7,000 residents. The Rajneeshis registered to vote in Antelope in large numbers. When the town tried to disincorporate in 1982 to prevent a political takeover, the measure failed. They won a majority on the town council. In September 1984, the city was officially renamed the City of Rajneesh. The original residents described armed patrols through the streets at all hours, collapsing property values, and neighbors leaving one by one. Some said they kept weapons ready in case anyone came to their door at night. In 1984, members of the organization deliberately contaminated the food at 10 restaurants in the Dalles with salmonella bacteria, sickening 751 people. The goal was to keep local voters too ill to cast ballots in an upcoming county election. It remains the largest biological attack ever carried out on American soil. By 1985, investigators had closed in and the leadership fled. The residents who had stayed through all of it voted to restore the name Antelope. Today, the ranch is a Christian youth camp and Antelope has fewer than 50 residents. The people who lived through it don't talk about it much. The ones who moved away never really explained why they left. Number 1. Vanport, Oregon. On Memorial Day morning in 1948, nearly 19,000 people woke up in Oregon's second-largest city and received a notice from the housing authority telling them the dikes were safe, they would be warned if there was any danger, and they had nothing to worry about. That afternoon, the dike broke. Oregon's second-largest city was underwater in less than 2 hours. To understand why that matters, you have to understand what Vanport was and why it existed. During World War II, the Portland area became a major shipbuilding hub, and tens of thousands of workers arrived from across the country. Portland needed housing fast. A contractor named Henry Kaiser built an entire city on 648 acres of low-lying floodplain just north of Portland's city limits in 110 days. At its peak, Vanport housed over 40,000 people, the largest public housing development in the United States, with its own schools, fire department, hospital, and library. It was built outside Portland's city limits on purpose. Portland did not want that many workers, and in particular, that many black workers, inside its boundaries. About a third of Vanport's population was black, steered to specific sections of the city, while Portland's own housing market remained effectively closed to them. The schools in Vanport were integrated, the city around it was not. By 1948, the war was over. The shipyards had scaled back, and the people still living in Vanport were largely those with nowhere else to go, sitting on a floodplain, surrounded by dikes, 15 feet below the water level of the Columbia River. The notice they received that morning told them not to worry. The flood killed at least 15 people and left 18,000 homeless overnight. Portland had spent years keeping those residents out. Now it had no choice but to absorb them. In 1959, the Oregon Centennial Exposition was held on the exact site where Vanport had stood, a beer garden and a water show, with nothing to acknowledge what had been there 11 years before. Today, that land is Delta Park, the Portland International Raceway, and Heron Lakes Golf Course. The people jogging the trails and playing the fairways have no idea what is under their feet, or why it got there. Drop a comment and tell me what town or place in Oregon we should cover next. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one.